My name is Sarah Drasner, as Oliver said. I am just ecstatic to be up here talking to you guys because I am getting to speak about the thing that I love the most in the world, which is intricate SVG animations. So this is me as a kid, but also my relationship to authority. I'm Sarah Drasner. Before we get into all of these really fun things that we can do with SVG, we should talk a little bit about why and do kind of the responsible thing of looking at what the benefits are of why we're working with these technologies. So animation in general is really powerful to convey meaning. When you're looking at a website, you're never just looking at it. You are scanning the environment with spatial awareness, an event called saccade. And nothing is more powerful than animation to convey meaning because your animal brain is kind of trained to notice things like motion. So any kind of motion or movement is going to draw your eye more than anything else. But that's also why animation gets a bit of a bad rap, because you can really overdo it very easily. This talk in particular is less about functional animation like UI, UX animation, and more about some of the fun things that you can do, but we're going to talk a little bit about that too. It can really guide your users because it's one of those things that just draws your eye so strongly. It can retain context for the user, so if we're talking about those spatial maps and spatial awareness, it can actually keep the context between one state and another, which is really, really great. I'll show some examples of that. It can cut down on perceived wait time, and I'll go into very specific examples of that. But basically, anytime you're waiting for something and something is grabbing your attention or calling your attention, it can make it feel like there's less time going on. And if it's built correctly, animation can be really useful and performant. I'm going to show you all of the ways that you can make SVG animations super, super performant. And also because otherwise we're not using the web to its full potential. The web is more than a static, bright box, and there's so much we can do with it. And SVGs really allow us to have that marriage of kind of art and math and dig into some of those beautiful and brilliant technologies. And also because it's fun. So, and the last thing, again, I said this earlier, but because animation is so powerful, it's really important that you not overdo it. So SVG, why are we talking about SVG? It's crisp on any display, it's resolution independent, and what that means is that even if you're on a Retina device, you don't have to cut different images. It's scalar vector graphics, that's in the name, so it can easily scale to all devices. There's less HTTP requests to handle because you're not having to do all of those image replacements. It's easily scalable for responsive. It's a very small file size if you design for performance. We're going to talk about that last piece of if you design for performance as we go on, and I'll show you exactly how small that can be. It's really easy to animate. It has a navigable DOM. That means that you can reach inside of it and move things around, which is super awesome. And it's really easy to make accessible, which is great for screen readers and blind people. And also it's really fun. There's a pattern here. What I hear most when I talk about SVG and some of the trepidations that I hear from developers is that they think it's not well supported. And it wasn't well supported for a long time. But now look at all that green. There's tons of support for it. And I will show you how to make fallbacks, but you might not need them. SVG is really, really powerful to tell stories. The marriage of text and images can be extremely powerful for narrative. But before we get started showing you how to actually do all of these things, let's talk about optimization. I found that Illustrator is better than Sketch for working with SVG because Sketch has poor export settings. I really hope that someone in the audience here works for Sketch and they fix those. But in the meantime, work with Illustrator and don't use save as, use export as, and you'll have a better output. Some of the tools that I use to also, just exporting as doesn't do the whole job. Some of the tools that I use to clean up my SVGs are SVG OMG. This one's really awesome by Jake Archibald. It's basically like a web-based GUI for the SVGO, which is terminal-based. Even if you want to use your terminal, you should be using SVGO GUI, which I also have a link for. It's really important that you have a GUI because the way that you optimize can actually completely change the way that the SVG looks. Peter Collinridge's SVG editor is also pretty awesome. It has a editor tab, which is kind of experimental, so you can play with it right in the browser. It's a little bit older than Jake Archibald's version. So before we get started, let's talk about animation performance. People actually expect mobile to be faster than the web, which is kind of crazy if you're a developer. You're like, no, it's not just like a tiny little website on your phone where you're like having to condense all of this information and send it over this like insecure connection on these smaller devices. But people don't really see it that way. So if you're going to design for responsive animation, SVGs are a really good option. Jankfree.org has a ton of resources. It's like Paul, ArrowTwist, and like Paul Irish, and all of the really good Pauls on the Chrome Dev Tools team work on that, and they kind of talk about all the ways to remove jank, which is that kind of stutter while you're working with SVG animation. But the kind of spoiler alert that I can tell you is that you should be using transforms and opacity. It might sound very, very constrictive to only use those two properties, but transforms are really, really robust, and all of the pens I'm going to show you today pretty much just use those two properties to animate them. There's advanced performance audits with DevTools with Paul Irish, and those are really cool. He like digs into the timeline, and he's like a sleuth, and he finds all of these things, and it's really very interesting. So if you're nerdy like me, you might like it. I wrote a CSS Tricks article called Weighing SVG Animation Techniques with Benchmarks. I'll kind of go through some of the things that I found there. But one thing I will say is that article was written a year ago, and you should be testing things for yourself, because even the way that the browsers report these things and the libraries move and all of those things change over time, which is great for us as web developers. It means things are always moving forward, and we gather the benefits of that. But it does mean that those results are going to shift and move. Above all else, you should be testing things for yourself. So test all the things. So how does animation help, like concretely? In terms of custom loaders, Viget did an experiment with these kind of like old-timey loaders that everybody is used to on the web, and one that they made that was just one of their own that was custom. And they found that people were willing to wait almost twice as long for the custom loader as for the kind of like normal web version. So animation can help in like cueing to your users that you care about them, that you're on your way, that you're getting there. It also helps with things like morphing. We talked a little bit about spatial awareness. So if we have something like this map marker, and we open it up, and it's a contact form, and the contact becomes the title, and the email is like moving out of the way, that placeholder. The submit button becomes the loader, so you know that something's going on in the background, and then you get a strong success when it's sent successfully. And then it goes right back to where it was. If I ask you later, where is the contact form, you'd say, oh, it's in there. There's no in there. They're all just divs. But what's really nice is it allows the user to have that map and have that context shift as it's going through all of those motions. And what's really nice about that is that instead of popping modal in front, modal and modal and modal in front of your face, or shifting to different screens, you make the whole experience feel much more intuitive and fluid. We just showed you like 4 different interfaces, and it didn't feel like that. It felt like one. So there's also like lots of nice small things that you can do with animation. A kind of common UI UX example would be like you want to like have a search, and then the SVG kind of just gets out of your way and moves, and it's like a lot of saved information, a lot of saved space that you don't have to have having all that information in place from the get-go. So when we're looking at what is actually happening here, what the actual code is, it's pretty simple. I'm saving the easing variables to use later and use them consistently throughout the site so that I know that all of my eases kind of have that same natural feel because they are mirrored with each other. I'm not using a bounce 1 minute and like another kind of ease another minute. So that's really nice. And then if we look at what's happening with the JavaScript, it's actually really quite simple. I did this as like the simplest jQuery version I could because it's just really awesome. All I'm doing is changing that attribute to be longer and shorter, and SVG is really easy to manipulate this way. So one key thing, so Chris Coyer asked me to do this kind of like Easter egg logo on CSS Tricks, if you know what CSS Tricks is. So when you hit this button, it turns in and morphs, and it has all these kind of like nerdy things hiding in here. So we've got like a link, and like our logo is that query selector all-star, and you know there's brackets and things like that. So the ways that I do that with the morphing is basically to design everything, is just to put everything inside the SVG, and then I can slowly reveal and show things and make things go from one to another. So if you design everything first and then slowly show things as you're going, it makes it a lot more easy to animate. If your designer is different from your developer, it makes it a lot easier to pair because you're giving them all the information up front. And these kind of like terrible, ugly things that I definitely like did not plan on showing anybody in the world, and definitely not that bee, actually saved me a lot of time. All of these ugly storyboards allow me to get ideas out really quickly, trash them, just draw them out really, really, like iterate really, really fast, and then I'm able to plan for things as I'm moving forward. So ugly storyboards save you a ton of time. I don't even remember what this was for. Like, I really just don't. So like getting all of these ideas out on paper really helps you like understand the directions that you're going. So correct tools for the job. I work with animation and SVG animation all the time. I'm a naturally curious person. I bump my head into everything and fail all the time. And so I benefit from that by playing with all of these different technologies, but you don't have to do that. I'm just going to give you like a succinct summary of what I think each one is good for. And again, these are just my opinions, but like this is what I think you probably should be working with. CSS, SCSS, Sass, Stylus, all of those are really, really great for small sequences and simple interactions. But once you get to a bunch of kind of sequences and chained events, you should really consider switching to GreenSock. I'm going to go into a lot of depth on GreenSock today because I think it's a really, really powerful tool, and I'll explain why. But it's really great for sequencing and complex movement. It also offers, and this is probably the biggest reason I use it, really, really good cross-browser consistency. So there's all sorts of like strange browser bugs with SVG animation. If you get to like Safari mobile, like especially older versions, is just not great. GSAP like fixes all of those scenarios for you, so you don't even have to worry about that. I also really like working with React Motion if you're working with React. It tends to be really good for single kind of events. It's a little bit more like game-based animation, where you are basically giving something mass and physics and then sending it on its way. So it's very dissimilar to CSS and SCSS and GSAP, because those are more like sequential and timed animations where you're thinking about things in terms of like 0.5 seconds. This is not as controlled in that way, but it can be really, really beautiful, and I'll show you why. Snap SVG, people always come up to me and say like, well, what do you think about Snap SVG? It's actually not an animation library. If you ask Dimitri, the guy who wrote it, he never intended it to be. He actually meant it to be a jQuery for SVG because jQuery doesn't support SVG. Even if you look in his examples, a lot of times those like beautiful animation examples are actually using CSS. So keep that in mind. He recommends GreenSock, actually. The Web Animations API looks really great, but it's still under development and has poor support. You can use it with a polyfill, but the spec is kind of moving and changing every day, so I would definitely not suggest using it in a production environment yet, but someday. Velocity is kind of similar to GSAP, and it's a little bit less robust, but what I found in those SVG animation benchmarks that I wrote for CSS Tricks was that it's not very performant. So I would avoid using it, and it's also not really under development anymore. Mo.js looks great, and it's really, really awesome. It's by a guy named Lego Mushroom. He makes really great demos. You should definitely check out his work. But it's still in beta. And again, just like the Web Animations API, it's still moving around a little bit. So I would definitely suggest playing with it. It's very interesting, but don't put it in production yet. Great. So we got done with all of the responsible things. Now let's do some kind of fun stuff. First, we're going to start with GreenSock, GSAP. We're going to talk about them almost the whole time. So when I said it solves cross-browser inconsistencies, this is one really bad one. IE doesn't even support transforms on SVG at all, and you can use it on IE all the way back to, I think, IE 8 for GreenSock, so that's super awesome. Some of these are really weird. Like the Firefox one, I think that one is fixed, but there's one with like an opacity plus transform in Safari that's just really bad. So some of these things are reason enough in and of itself to work with GreenSock and GSAP. I really like the timeline, though. The timeline is really, really super powerful. I'll show you why. You can stack tweens, set them a little before and after one another. You can change their placement in time. You can group them into scenes. You can add relative labels. You can animate the scenes, so you can animate your animations, which is really nice. You can make the whole thing faster, move the placement of the whole scene. You can nest things, all without recalculation. And this is one of the issues that I have with CSS animations. Let's say you have two things firing at the same time, and they both happen at 33%. If somebody needs you to move one of those animations, you have to do all of this recalculation of percentages, whereas with GSAP, you could add a relative label and have them both fire at the same time. And this might seem like an edge case, but I have never made a longer, complex animation where I didn't have to do some timing recalculation. So this ends up saving you a ton of time, particularly if you get all the way through an animation and you're like, oh man, the beginning is a little bit funky. So this is really, really awesome. So this pen kind of helps illustrate that. So if we've got this animation running, there's like that middle part that kind of fires a few times, and then there's a couple of other scenes. And if we look at it, the position on the GSAP timeline, we can map it to that one fires a few times on the timeline. And then that first one kind of happens at the get. The second one, you can see, you don't need me to narrate all of it. So what's great is if I have these all in functions, I can basically just change, like swap their positions around, and it can fire in a different order. I don't even have to change the functions. I'm just changing one line of code there. And I can also make the whole thing faster with one line of code. So that's pretty cool. So how do we do it? I'm actually like really, really terrible at live coding. So I built you a responsive GreenSock teaching monster. He's going to teach you about GreenSock today. So this is a simple tween. We've just got like one line of code to make the eye move. And then if I have two tweens, they're going to fire at the same time. So now when we have a timeline, one of them is going to follow the other. And now I can make a master timeline, which is basically going to be the same thing, but I'm using this to show you how you can make more complex animations. So then we can add a whole nother scene. And you'll notice it doesn't matter what order it is, what order those functions are in, just like regular JavaScript. You're adding it to the master, and now he flaps his wings. So other really cool things for complex animation. It has the widest support for motion along a path. Motion along a path is really, really important for kind of like really natural movement. There are things that just don't go like from here to there to here to there. So basically Smile was like the native SVG animation thing, and it's becoming deprecated. IE and Chrome don't support it anymore. It is moving into CSS, but until it fully moves into CSS, GSAP actually has the longest tail of support back to IE 8. Draggable is really fun. You can drag and throw things and move them around. I'm going to show you demos for all of these things. CSS properties like 3D, you can move things in space, you can move things on the Z-axis. Draw SVG, you know, all of those like cool demos where it looks like the thing is drawing itself. Morph SVG, which is kind of like how I was morphing and shaping all of those things. Relative color tweening, which is super awesome, and I'll show you why. Cycle staggers, so you can have things that are staggering but to different values. So first, let's start with like the most basic and work up. Relative color tweening is kind of nice because before you'd have to like, in order to change these turtles, I'd have to change the fill value of every single shape. But if I want to make these turtles just a little bit brighter, a little more saturated, change their hue, and they do this like little thing with their tail that I think is cute. I don't know if it's weird to like think your own stuff is cute. You're like, hi, turtles. And you could keep going with the hue, and it'll eventually go all the way back around, but eventually the saturation and brightness will hit a point where it doesn't go anymore. So if I'm incrementing, I'm going to show you a piece of code and then show you what the result is. Obviously, for the SVG elements, I'm changing the fill. So I actually cache that as a variable because I'm going to use it twice. I'm going to use it for the fill, and I'm also going to use it for the background color for the div that's behind everything. So then when I have this pen, which is a city construction site, get it, website, lots of more dad jokes where that came from. So I can basically build this city. On rock and roll, I guess, and then have this whole thing come up and play with the timeline that way. But I can also change these and have these hue saturation values be slightly different from each other, so I get like slightly different results as I'm playing with them. This is going to change the like perspective of the background, and you get to like just kind of have fun with it. So draw SVG. I'm going to show you how you can work with this like just in CSS and what's happening under the hood, because I like knowing what's happening under the hood, but also some like things that GSAP does that makes it go above and beyond. So it's very, very simple code. So it's just that one line of code. I'm going from 0 to true. But under the hood, it's done with stroke dash array and stroke dash offset. So if you can imagine that you have like a shape and it has a stroke around it, and that stroke is dashed, but then the dash is the entire length of the whole thing, and then you can actually animate the offset of that dash. So it's looking like it's going all the way around. So you can use JavaScript to get total length. That's a native method, and then it will just return the value of that whole thing, and that's what I did here. It's 274, and then I can animate it. So it's pretty cool. What's really cool about GSAP, and all of these demos are done by me except for this one and one other one. This is actually a green sock pen, because if I did this demo, I'd just be copying them anyway. There's percentage, there's integer values. You can do 50% to 50%, which is nice, collapse the whole thing. There's Boolean values. So there's a lot of things you can do with green sock's thing that's like really, really fast way of working with these draw SVG values. So I love Shel Silverstein, so I thought like as a tribute to him on his birthday, I would make this like little pen about this hot dog with everything on it. So I just took one of his drawings, and it just looks like it's drawing itself onto the thing through that draw SVG. So motion along a path. This is a really fun one. I just like think it's really, really a blast. So I wanted to do fireflies. I spend a lot of time looking at weird YouTube videos to like make these things. Like how do fireflies work? So when I'm watching the fireflies, they kind of flicker around and do these kind of strange movements, and it's not very intuitive. So if you were going to try to do that with XY values, that'd be pretty difficult one by one. So what motion along a path allows for is a couple of things like that auto rotate as it's like moving around, and I'll show you a demo of that. But also like the ability to finite control all of the ways that it's moving through those. So I'm just passing an array of values, and then I can kind of move it through those values. But what's really neat is that you can set a curviness value. So this one's set to 0, and this one's set to 2. If I set it to 6, you can see that it starts to kind of unravel. And if I set it to 2 again, this one like kind of goes like from one to the other, and the other one kind of makes a curve. So basically what's happening is, imagine you have a rubber band, and you are like stretching it across these values. So if it's set to 0, that rubber band's going to be taut. But as you kind of loosen those values as the integer grows, it's going to get a little bit more curvy. So it's going to, at 2, it's going to get like a full round. But when you get down to 7 or 8, that whole rubber band's going to start to loop back on itself, and that's basically what you're seeing in those curviness values. So another thing is that auto-rotate true. I kind of like very quickly went over that, but what's really happening here is really awesome for complex movement, because if it's not set, you can see this guy, I don't know what he is. I think he's an owl, but like somebody else thought he was a fish. I make these things late at night, I'm not sure. And he kind of like follows that path with his body. So you can see how that auto-rotate true when you don't have something like that set, and when you're not using something like motion along a path, would be really hard to emulate. You'd have to do all of these rotation values. So cycle stagger is pretty awesome. This is pretty great. So like, if I'm working with these values, this is like a very, very, very small amount of code. And I'll show you in a second after it's done running. So I just use Haml to drum up a bunch of things at once. I've got like a SAS color mix-in to kind of loop through all of these values and give it that's what gives it a slightly different color for each of the boxes. And then in the JavaScript, you can see how easy this is. This is like, I'm basically giving it a few different values to cycle in between, and it'll take each one of those shapes and go from one to another with a bunch of different values. So you can do those crazy things like see it explode and come back together really, really easily. Draggable is super fun. I think it's really great. I decided like, what better to use Draggable for than to make a Mr. Potato Head. I used to do this before my hair was red, which made more sense because it was blonde. Now I gotta like put shoes on my head and stuff. You kind of get it. So yeah, and it's really very simple. If you use throw props, you can see how that movement is kind of nice. It doesn't just like stop when you stop moving it, just like a regular thing. It's device-enabled for touchscreen, which is awesome. You can impose bounds, so you can like set parameters around the object. You can have momentum with that throw props. You can check for hit tests, so you can see if things are hitting each other, which is kind of nice for things like video games or something like that, if you're going to try to do stuff like that with SVG. It honors transform origin, which is great. It still works on transformed elements. And you can lock an axis, so you can have it only work on X or Y. It's GPU accelerated and request animation frame driven, so it's got like high performance values. And there's tons more stuff that I don't have to go over. You can check out the docs. So you can actually attach Draggable to a timeline value and have that like rotate over the thing. So if I'm going to like make a party, I can just like drag this around, or I can have JavaScript be my event coordinator, get it event, tons of dad jokes. So it kind of just like allows me to like control all of those, and I'll show you the code that makes this. I have just like a regular master timeline here, and then I'm setting the type on Draggable to rotation. I have the minimum rotation to 0 and then 360, which is a circle. And then I set the master progress along that rotation value. So it's really, really easy to like attach things like Draggable and the timeline, which is pretty cool. So it's got rich callback and event dispatching on press, on drag start, on drag, on drag-in, on release, all of these things. So there's tons and tons of things that you can do with this tool. I made this like responsive, we're going to start talking about responsive now. I made this like responsive cow that goes over the moon. If you guys are ever on CodePen, there used to be like these like CodePen weekends where they'd give you like a theme. It wasn't even like the CodePen team was doing this. It was just a bunch of nerds like me. And we'd like give ourselves a theme, and one of the themes was Holy Space Cows Weekend. And so we all made these dumb, silly pens. And so I decided to make this cow that goes over the moon and scares this, astronaut. I had a friend who was like trying to see how many throws he get. I think he got 5. I can't do that. But so what's really nice about this is it's also responsive, so I can keep playing with it on mobile. And I said like touch device enabled for touchscreen, totally rad. So let's go into responsive just a little bit more. There's this great technique by Joe Harrison that was on Smashing Magazine about how you could do this like kind of image replacement using the VIEWBOX for all of these like more and more complex icons. Let's use that technique to do some really cool stuff. So if I make it a responsive sprite, if I'm doing like an illustration or something like that, I can make like a little map for myself on the side where I'm doing like a Book of Kells illustration, and I've got this A, like initial letter, and then I've got like the tablet version, and then I have the mobile version. But I can also see that some of these things are repeated, and because I'm a developer, I want to like not repeat myself. So I make this sprite that's one size, and I take out all of the shapes that are repeated and put classes on the ones that I want to like hide and show. So we have something like this pen that's an animation that can completely respond to the viewport. And the really cool part is that the whole animation and SVG was 8 kilobytes gzipped. If you compare that to like a normal image that you use to show on the web, like illustrating an article, 120 kilobytes, 100 kilobytes, like you're doing pretty well. And it's also really engaging and fun. So some of these things are performant and creative and engaging, which is just super awesome. So we can do stuff like this that's fully responsive in every direction. One of the I'm going to like let this play and then I'll show you. One of the really cool things about the SVG DOM is that you're working within the SVG DOM, so it's like as it's moving, and I can completely resize all of this stuff, and it will retain the same values because it's like working within that DOM structure. So that's awesome. But our responsive development doesn't just happen with these like squishy viewports, right? That's just not the way that we work with responsive development. So let's actually work with real responsive design. So I built this thing like Legos. I'm kind of designing it to have interlocking pieces. I have these things that are like working within, I have interaction that's working within each one of these things. So I have like a design that are like scoped to pieces of functions so that the design and the JavaScript are doing basically the same thing. They're basically in the same groups. I know just where to go when I'm trying to manipulate things. So this thing is a responsive, huggy laser panda factory like you have around. And this thing puts a laser, chip in his head, and then he becomes lasered. And then this one makes him a panda. And this one is like going to make him huggy. But the really cool part is that I can resize this, and they reconfigure and flip around, and it still works on mobile. So that's pretty cool. And it's really pretty simple. I'm like creating these functions, pausing it initially, and then when you hit a certain piece of the SVG, it's re-triggering it. There's also really cool things that we can do with atmosphere. Atmosphere is really important when you're working with animation. It can actually kind of be the character. Like this animation in itself, there's no real character, just that like ethereal quality that's happening with it. So if we're working with elemental motion, like how do we even get started with something like this? It seems a little tricky at first, but we know that there are some rules. So like things that are further away are in less contrast and kind of blurry. We ask ourselves, does the air environment affect the movement? Reducing precision for this actually allows for us to understand. I'll show you what that looks like. So like if I'm looking at trying to make this smoke, that seems kind of hard. It seems kind of complicated. But if I start to reduce the precision here, I can start to see some shapes come out in that smoke. It's like, okay, well, there's some repeated patterns here. And so what's happening? So the air is like pushing back on all of those circles as it's moving forward. And like, okay, there we go. Like, I can definitely animate that now. So let's put some techniques together. We showed you like the morphing, and we've got these elemental animations. So morph SVG is really great because you can tween paths, tween shapes to paths, basically make animation magic. You're just pointing from one ID to another with this plugin, and it doesn't have to be the same amount of path values, which is what you need for something like Snap SVG. So really the code is simple. I'm pointing from one ID to another, and it knows to tween from one thing to another. I can also use this tool called Shape Index, which brings up this GUI, and it'll kind of go to this auto value, but if you play with it, it allows you like this finite precision over like how you want that animation to look. So even the way that it's tweening is totally up to you. So I made this candle. And I think the cool thing about stuff like the candle is that you think of SVG as being these hard, rigid shapes. And you don't think of it as being able to make these kind of like, you know, squishy or like elemental or kind of ethereal things. But let's look at how this was done. So just for some clarity, I made some of the shapes blue so you could see them a little bit better. I made a bunch of these kind of candle shapes. I have this like shape in the background that's kind of this gradient, and I just expand and collapse it. I'm changing the like opacity values, and you can see those purple, that's like the little pieces that are moving upwards. And just the rest of the body is just like little shapes I drew and put a gradient on in Illustrator. I also use a technique that this guy named Lucas Beber made, which is this GUI menu. So he figured out that if you are working with SVG filters and you use a contrast and blur filter at the same time, it makes this nice goo effect, which is really, really cool for some of the stuff that we're doing. So usually, those filter effects, those standard deviations of the filter effects are not animatable properties, but GSAP doesn't really care if it's an animatable property or not. It's just tweening integers. So it actually allows you to animate things that aren't really usually animatable. And then I have a really basic for loop going through all of those shapes while that filter is changing. And I've got a nice little math.random in there so that I can make things like kind of change depending on, you know, chance. But there's more than one way of working with this stuff. So if I look at this pen by Blake Bowen, what he did was this thing called a Cat-Mill-Rom spleen. He's not the one who invented the Cat-Mill-Rom spleen, but he's using it here with a polyline in SVG. And basically what it does is that same kind of thing of like smoothing out those values that you saw in the motion along a path demo. So if you have a bunch of points like this, I could just have done these with like a math.random on these point values, or like changing these point arrays. So I could have also just done it with math, which is really one of the nice things about SVGs. You can actually make these really beautiful and ethereal things with math. So last couple things before we wrap up with GSAP. Accessibility is really easy by just adding title and associative ARIA tags. We actually just came out with an article on CSS tricks that I helped do technical edits for. That's all about accessible SVGs and all the different ways that you can work with them and when you're making animations with them. It's a great resource. They tested everything on all these screen readers. It's awesome. There's also a resource here with support charts and an article by Dudley Story. One of the last techniques we're going to use is VIEWBOX as a camera. So a lot of people are kind of confounded by what a VIEWBOX is, but we're just going to go over it really, really quick to show you some of this technique. So the VIEWBOX has 4 values. It's 0, 0 here, which is the x and y topmost value, and then a width and a height. Pretty simple. So when you're, and one of the nice things, one of the reasons I'm showing you on this grid is because you can make the SVG bigger and smaller, but it's still plotting along those points. You can think of it like a game of Battleship or something. It's still using those plots on the grid, no matter how big or small it gets, which is why it's scalable. Now there's also other little points on that grid, right? So this is 215 and 160 in on that grid, and 42 over, the width and the height. So if I want to animate this VIEWBOX, I can actually ask for this native method called getViewBox, and it will return an SVG rect, which is an object, and it has in it x, y, and width and height, which is great. That's exactly what we need. So we can actually make these things that are kind of a little bit more dynamic. So I can just grab the getViewBox value and update that new VIEWBOX, and then I can have it just go to these little houses instead of the whole thing. So if I'm using this for data visualization, I can zoom in on a country. And I can also have it be completely responsive. So this is really good for data visualization. That's a really nice way of just showing information really quick instead of showing just the country. Another thing it could do is make a flow chart. So if I'm updating the values based on this flow chart, I can ask people questions, and it can actually update based on that. And based on the position, I can have these other animations trigger, which is really nice. And that's a really, really simple function that I'm plugging into again and again, where I'm just updating that value every time, and then the VIEWBOX is basically animating and redrawing. So the last thing is React Motion before we go. I only have a couple demos for React Motion. It's also good for things like, has Babel compiling, so it's probably going to take more of a second. So you can use it with SVG. It has really nice motion for hover effects and stuff. And we can still do things with responsive, which is nice. But what's really cool is the staggering motion. So usually when we're working with staggers, it's really just a value, and then they take the value and update everything else. So if you have a bunch of list items, it's taking it and applying that same thing to all of the list items. But the difference between staggering motion and React Motion is that it's being updated from the last value. So it's getting it kind of for free, but it's updating from the last value's coordinate, which means that you can have these really beautiful and kind of more natural movements as you're working with staggering motion. So social coding sites help you learn. I really love CodePen. There's JS Fiddle and Dablet as well. I think it's really great to reverse engineer other people's stuff, see what other people are doing. The open source community there is really strong. When you've made something that you're really proud of, you can show it off there. And just because I'm their propaganda, I guess, I made a CodePen propaganda poster. I don't work for CodePen, I just really like them. So, in Soviet San Francisco, the CodePen is loaded with you. And there's a ton of people making great stuff. I'm definitely not the only one working with SVG. So here is a giant list of people you should go follow and go check out their work on CodePen. I have more technical information in a longer course that's a front-end master's course. So if you like this, you can watch a lot more of it there. And I'm also writing an O'Reilly book. This is not the O'Reilly book. This was my friend trolling me. That's not even my last name. I don't have a man blob animal as my animal. I do have a fancy chicken, though. So this is my book, and it should be coming out later this year. And thank you.